Welcome to the fourth episode of Yɛresiesie Yɛn, the Preparation for Reparations podcast. I'm your host, Esther Xosei of the Maangamizi Educational Trust. For those joining us for the first time, Yɛresiesie Yɛn is a powerful phrase from our Akan ancestors and ancestresses, meaning we are preparing ourselves. This reminds us that reparations isn't something passively received, it's something we actively create and take through preparation and strengthening. I want to emphasize that this preparation is not merely preliminary work or something that happens before reparations. Preparation is a large part of the work of effecting and securing reparations itself. It is through our systematic preparation, documenting our truths, building our communities, strengthening our organizations, and developing our analysis that we build the collective power necessary to both demand and implement meaningful repair. When we say Yɛresiesie Yɛn, we are acknowledging that our preparation creates the conditions for justice by shifting power relations, not just getting ready for some distant future moment. In our previous episodes, we've explored how preparation is power, examined Ma'at Zoazajuras as practical tools for community-led reparations work, and discussed the revolutionary power of documentation. Today, in the first of a two-part episode, we will confront a critical challenge in our reparations journey: overstanding the tactics used to neutralise, co-opt and derail our movements. In part 2, we'll explore strategies for protecting our movements against these threats. But before we begin, let us pour libation to honour our ancestors and ancestresses and set our intentions. We pour libation to the Creator, the source of all life, all potential, all wisdom. To Mother Earth, who teaches us resilience and interconnection, who nurtures and sustains life, who holds the memory of countless generations. We pour libation to the ancestors and ancestresses who came before us, to those who built movements that could not be captured or compromised, whose strategic wisdom guides our protection work, whose principled stance inspires our integrity, whose creative resistance shows us paths forward, to those who protected the movements before us, who refused compromise when principle was at stake, who maintained vision when others accepted limitations. May our words honour their sacrifices. May our works advance their unfinished struggle. May we embody their courage, their clarity, their unwavering commitment. Ashe, Ashe, Ashe-yo. As our reparations movement gains momentum and visibility, we face increasingly sophisticated efforts to neutralise its transformative potential. This process, what scholars and activists call movement capture, is not a conspiracy theory, but a documented pattern in how power responds to challenges. Professor Kimberly Crenshaw's work on intersectionality demonstrates how movements are often redirected towards addressing only the most privileged members of marginalized groups. In her words, there is a tendency to treat race and gender as mutually exclusive categories of experience and analysis, which undermines the potential for comprehensive justice. Ghanaian philosopher and Afrocentrist Professor Kwame Gyekye offers crucial insights through his concept of institutional domestication, the process by which radical movements are absorbed into existing power structures and stripped of their transformative potential. In his work, Tradition and Modernity, he demonstrates how colonial and neo-colonial systems incorporate elements of resistance while neutralizing their fundamental challenges to power. The history of reparations movements globally shows that as demands for substantive repair gain traction, they are met with efforts to first narrow the definition of what constitutes reparations from comprehensive repair to mere financial compensation. This strips away the structural, cultural and political dimensions of reparatory justice. Second, to shift decision-making power from affected communities to established institutions and so-called experts. This converts a process of community self-determination into one of bureaucratic management. Thirdly, to replace radical demands with symbolic gestures and performative acknowledgements. Apologies, commemorations, and heritage projects, and sometimes healing projects, become substitutes for material and structural change. And fourthly, to individualize collective or group claims, transforming a movement for collective liberation into a series of individual piecemeal grievances. This atomization fragments solidarity and obscures the systematic nature of the Maangamizi. These tactics aren't always deployed with conscious intent. Often, they reflect institutional habits for managing challenges to power. As Arundhati Roy observes in Public Power in the Age of Empire, the NGOization of resistance turns people into dependent victims and blunts political resistance. Real politics is alive, dangerous, and unpredictable. Kenyan philosopher and Pan-Africanist D.A. Masolo, in his work African Philosophy in Search of Identity, shows how Western intellectual frameworks function to domesticate African liberation thought. His analysis helps us understand how reparations concepts can be systematically stripped of their radical content through academic and institutional processing. Movement capture operates through several mechanisms we must recognize: the co-optation of language, the elevation of acceptable voices, institutional channeling, selective funding, and the deliberate stretching of time frames through what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. called the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. So I'll just break down some of these terms that I just described. Institutional channeling means redirecting movement energy and demands into official processes, committees, or bureaucratic pathways that absorbed activist time and energy while producing minimal change. For example, when demands for reparations are directed into study commissions that last for years without leading to concrete action, or when grassroots activists are pulled into endless consultation processes that drain their energy without resulting in meaningful policy change, or just having endless conferences that do not really result in progressing the reparations agenda forward. So selective funding or resources refers to how financial resources flow primarily to organizations and initiatives that frame reparations in ways compatible with existing power structures, while more radical approaches remain under-supported and under-resourced. This creates financial incentives for movements to moderate their demands and tactics. For instance, foundations might fund educational programs about historical injustice, but not initiatives focused on land reclamation or economic dimensions of repair. As for the tranquilizing drug of gradualism, which is Dr. King's powerful phrase from his I Have a Dream speech, where he warned against accepting incremental change that delays justice indefinitely. In the context of reparations movements, this refers to how urgent demands are subjected to endless delays, studies, and promises of future action that stretch the time frame for justice beyond what movements can sustain. This tactic convinces people to accept minimal progress by framing comprehensive immediate demands as unrealistic, while positioning minimal delayed action as pragmatic. Overstanding these dynamics isn't cause for despair, but for strategic clarity. By recognizing patterns of movement capture, we can develop countermeasures to protect the integrity and power of our reparations work. Counterinsurgency tactics against reparations movements. Beyond subtle co-optation, reparations movements also face more direct forms of suppression through counterinsurgency tactics. When we overstand reparations as fundamentally challenging the legitimacy of wealth and power built on colonial extraction, we can recognize why such movements face coordinated resistance. Pan-African scholar and activist Professor Mucheri Mugo, in her work Writing and Speaking from the Heart of Struggle, analyzes how colonial powers systematically deploy counterinsurgency tactics against African liberation movements. She documents how these tactics extend beyond physical repression to include intellectual containment and narrative control, especially relevant to reparations movements that challenge historical narratives. Contemporary counterinsurgency against reparations movements operates through several key tactics. 1. Being surveillance and monitoring. Reparations organizations and their leadership face both covert and overt monitoring. Digital surveillance through social media tracking, infiltration of meetings, and monitoring of communications creates chilling effects on organizing. Next we have character assassination. Leaders who effectively articulate reparations demands face coordinated attempts to undermine their credibility. Their personal histories are scrutinized, their words taken out of context, and their intentions misrepresented. We need look no further than recent media attacks on reparations advocates in the UK. In August 2023, for example, GB News published a deliberately inflammatory article, Exposed Labour-Linked Reparations Activists' Controversial Past, supposedly about my own reparations activism, taking statements out of context and attempting to associate me with statements that I never made. This hit piece was strategically timed to undermine the growing parliamentary discussions around reparations through the All-Party Parliamentary Group for African Reparations. The article follows a similar playbook, cherry-picking statements from different contexts, removing important nuances, and employing guilt by association techniques. Most tellingly, it sought to discredit the entire concept of reparations by attacking the character of individual advocates rather than engaging with substantive arguments. And they did it again in October 2024. Kenyan philosopher Professor Ngugi wa Thiong'o's concept of decolonizing the mind helps us overstand these attacks as attempts to maintain colonial control not just over resources, but over the very categories of thought that define what is possible. In his work, Decolonizing the Mind, he shows how imperial powers maintain control through language and narrative, including defining which demands for justice are considered reasonable. Other counterinsurgency tactics include divide and conquer strategies, economic pressure, deliberate misinformation campaigns, and the co-optation of potential allies. Overstanding these tactics prepares us to develop protective measures and resilient strategies. On the politics of respectability and resource control. Two interrelated challenges facing reparations movements involve the politics of respectability and the control of resources. Respectability politics, the pressure to present demands in ways which demand reasonable or respectable by those with power, serves to contain radical challenges. As Kimberly Crenshaw teaches us in her work on intersectionality, when movements fail to address multiple forms of oppression, they often reproduce the very hierarchies they claim to challenge. In her words, such approaches frequently operate within structures that reproduce Black women's subordination. Now, Ghanaian scholar Ama Atu Edu's critical analysis of neocolonialism exposes how colonial powers impose standards of acceptable resistance that effectively neutralize challenges to their authority. She demonstrates how the pressure to appear moderate serves to contain demands that fundamentally challenge unjust systems. In reparations movements, this manifests as pressures to moderate demands, a celebration of reasonableness, conditional solidarity, and tone policing. These dynamics create divisions between those willing to moderate their approach and those who maintain more radical or revolutionary positions. Closely related is the non-profit industrial complex, the network of organizations, funders, and governmental entities that shape how social justice work is resourced. As activist and scholar, Professor Andrea Smith defines it, this is a set of symbiotic relationships that link political and financial technologies of state and owning class control with surveillance over public political ideology, including and especially emergent progressive and leftist social movements. For reparations movements, funding dynamics create agenda-setting pressures, professionalization of demands, time frame constraints, mission drift, competition for resources, and depoliticization. The challenge is not to avoid institutional resources entirely, but to engage them strategically while maintaining movement integrity. We see this principle in action through groups like the December 12th Movement's self-funded initiatives and in COBRA's long-standing emphasis on membership-based resourcing to maintain independence in their advocacy work. These organizations demonstrate how resource autonomy enables more radical and consistent advocacy for comprehensive reparations. Symbolic versus substantive reparations. A common form of movement capture involves redirecting demands for substantive repair towards purely symbolic gestures. Overstanding the difference between symbolic and substantive reparations is crucial to protecting the integrity of our work. Symbolic reparations include actions like formal apologies, commemorations, monuments, and educational initiatives. These acknowledge harm without significantly altering material conditions or power relations. Substantive reparations involve tangible transfers of resources and restructuring of power, including land return, monetary compensation, debt repudiation, institutional reforms or transformation, community control of resources, and political self-determination. As reparations scholar, Dr. Ana Lucia Araujo's research demonstrates in her book, Reparations for Slavery and the Slave Trade, symbolic gestures of acknowledgement have repeatedly been used to divert attention from demands for material restitution. She documents how apologies and commemorations without substantive repair often serve to close rather than advance discussions of justice. Now, legendary Pan-African intellectual Professor Walter Rodney provides essential analysis for overstanding this pattern. In How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, Rodney demonstrates that European wealth was systematically built through African exploitation. His work makes clear why symbolic acknowledgements without material transfer of resources cannot constitute meaningful repair. This pattern appears consistently across contexts. Colonial powers offer apologies without returning stolen artifacts or transferring wealth. Universities rename buildings while maintaining endowments built from enslavement or colonization. And governments fund commemorations while continuing discriminatory policies. Martinican philosopher and revolutionary Dr. Frantz Fanon's analysis in The Wretched of the Earth shows why symbolic concessions often function as techniques of counterinsurgency. Fanon reveals how colonial powers offer superficial reforms precisely to prevent fundamental challenges to their authority. His work teaches us to distinguish between reforms that reinforce existing power structures and those that genuinely advance liberation. Substantive African representation in reparations work. Central to protecting our reparations movements from capture is overstanding and demanding substantive African representation in all reparations processes. This concept is essential for ensuring authentic community voice and true accountability. As articulated by the Global African People's Parliament, we must distinguish between merely descriptive representation and genuinely substantive representation. Descriptive representation is simply having people who look like us in positions of authority, i.e. skinfolk, but it is insufficient, and descriptive representatives are easily co-opted. We've witnessed how officials of African heritage often advance agendas that do not serve our communities, precisely because they are not accountable to us. Substantive representation, by contrast, requires representatives who not only reflect our communities visually, but who are directly accountable to and mandated by our communities. These representatives must speak for, act for, and look after the interests of African heritage communities in accordance with varying measures of accountability to us. Under international law, as a people, we have an equal right to political representation. The United Nations Working Group of Experts of People of African Descent has recognized that without substantive representation, we experience what is called civil and social death. existing physically but not being recognised politically as belonging to a people with collective rights. The UN International Decades for People of African Descent, of which we are now in the second, emphasises the themes of recognition, justice and development, precisely because of this ongoing denial of our peoplehood. The reparations industrial complex frequently uses descriptive representation as a shield, appointing token African representatives who lack authentic connection to or accountability towards their broader African heritage communities. These individuals often negotiate compromised agreements that prioritize elite interests over community or group needs. This is what we've witnessed in Namibia, where state actors and political elites negotiated a so-called reconciliation agreement with Germany that many Over-Herero and Nama survivors of genocide rejected as inadequate and exclusionary. This pattern of elite capture contributes to what Professor Walter Rodney called the underdevelopment of Africa, and what Dr. Frantz Fanon described as the betrayal of national consciousness by the national bourgeoisie. When African elites negotiate reparations agreements without meaningful community participation or accountability mechanisms, they perpetuate rather than repair the historical and continuing harms of the Maangamizi. To help identify and prevent movement capture, elite capture, and state capture in reparations work, here are some essential questions we should ask when evaluating representatives, processes, and proposals. Questions to identify movement capture. Who is defining the language and framework of the reparations demand? Are African community-led definitions of repair being maintained, or has the language been diluted to make it more acceptable and palatable to establishment power? Who controls the timeline and urgency of the reparations process? Has the focus shifted from structural transformation to individual benefits? Have revolutionary demands been reframed as reforms that don't challenge fundamental power arrangements? Questions to identify elite capture. Now, elite capture manifests when the benefits of reparatory justice initiatives primarily flow to those already privileged within our communities, rather than reaching those most impacted by ongoing manifestations of the Maangamizi. So, some of the questions we could ask here to identify elite capture are: who selected the African heritage community representatives in this process? To whom are these representatives accountable, and through what mechanisms? Do these representatives have consistent histories of community organising, or are they primarily professionals without grassroots connections or relationships? Do they communicate regularly with affected communities about the negotiation process and what they're doing for us or on our behalf? Are their personal or career interests aligned with compromising on community demands? Do they centre African-centred principles like Ma'at, Ubuntu, and self-determination? Do they defend the rights of communities to direct representation in the process? Now moving on to questions to identify state capture. Now, state capture occurs when governments appropriate reparations narratives to serve their diplomatic or economic interests without addressing the structural causes of harm or centering affected communities. So some of the questions will include: has the state taken control of defining what constitutes adequate reparations? Is the state determining which voices are legitimate in representing African people's interests? Has the state created parallel institutions or processes that circumvent existing community-led reparation structures? Are government agencies directing funding to more moderate reparations organisations while marginalising those with more transformative demands? Is legislation being drafted without meaningful input from directly affected communities? And are state responses focusing on studying harm rather than implementing repair? In the second part of this episode, we will explore how to build movement protection strategies that ensure substantive African representation and prevent co-optation of our reparations demands. Reparations washing and the emerging reparations industrial complex. Beyond the co-optation of language and symbols, we must confront the emerging reparations industrial complex, where powerful institutions adopt the terminology of repair while emptying it of substantive content and transformative potential. This process takes several forms: elite capture of reparations negotiations, institutional reparations washing, and containment through concession. So speaking first to elite capture of reparations negotiations, which is a particularly insidious form of movement capture that occurs when reparations agreements are negotiated by elite representatives who lack substantive accountability to the communities they claim to represent. We see this in the case already mentioned of the Overherero and Nama peoples of Namibia, who have been forced to take legal proceedings against the government of Namibia because reparations negotiations excluded them and their direct representatives. The 2021 agreement between Germany and Namibia, in which Germany acknowledged the genocide but called the 1.1 billion euros payment development aid rather than reparations, was negotiated without the consent of the communities most affected by the genocide. And in fact, it really wasn't reparations. Now going on to talk about institutional reparations washing. So just as corporations engage in greenwashing to appear environmentally responsible without meaningful change, we now witness reparations washing, which has been popularised by Professor Kehinde Andrews, where universities, governments and corporations adopt the language of repair while avoiding substantive redistribution of resources or power. This allows these institutions to appear progressive while preserving existing power and economic arrangements. When thinking about containment through concession, this is best explained when movements gain sufficient power. Elites often respond with limited concessions designed to contain rather than address fundamental demands. These symbolic gestures, task forces and commissions and studies, or even modest payments, are then presented as comprehensive responses to claims that would require far more substantive transformations. In contrast, substantive African reparations movements, like that of the Stop the Maangamizi movement, initiated by the Stop the Maangamizi campaign, influenced by the Global African People's Parliament, insist on direct African representation and community control in all reparations processes. Nothing about us without us. Anything about us without us is against us. Similarly, coalitions like PARCO, the Pan-African Reparations Coalition in Europe, and the UBAD Educational Foundation, UEF, in Belize, maintain focus on comprehensive approaches to repair that centre African self-determination rather than elite negotiated compromises. These grassroots structures and initiatives follow Professor Molena Karenga's ethical framework for reparations, emphasizing that repair must encompass public admission, public apology, public recognition, comprehensive repair, and preventative measures against future harm. They recognize that repair is not merely about material compensation, but about transformative justice and the restoration of collective integrity through the process of surujta, that is, repairing and healing the world to make it more beautiful and beneficial than it was before. As we conclude the first part of our episode on movement capture and counterinsurgency, I want to emphasize that overstanding these tactics is not cause for despair. By recognizing the various ways in which our movements can be co-opted, diluted, or neutralized, we take the first step towards effective protection. We've explored how movement capture operates through the redefinition of demands, the elevation of acceptable voices, the substitution of symbolic for substantive repair, and the use of descriptive rather than substantive representation. We've examined how counterinsurgency tactics, from surveillance to character assassination to economic pressure, are deployed against those who demand transformative change. And we've identified the emerging reparations industrial complex that attempts to contain our demands through limited concessions and elite negotiations. In part 2 of this episode, we'll focus on practical strategies for protecting our movements from these forms of capture. We'll explore African-centered principles that can serve as anchors for our work, specific organizational structures that foster community accountability, approaches to building independent infrastructure, and methods for ensuring substantive African representation throughout the reparations process. As you prepare for part 2 of this episode, I encourage you to reflect on the forms of capture that we've discussed today. Consider how they might be operating in your own context, and begin to identify areas where your community's reparations work might be vulnerable to co-optation. By coming to our next discussion with this awareness, you'll be better prepared to engage with the protection strategies that we'll explore. This is Esther Xosei on behalf of the Maangamizi Educational Trust, reminding you that when we protect our movements from capture and neutralization, we are practicing Yɛresiesie Yɛn. We are preparing ourselves for the justice our communities deserve. Thanks to Brother Daniel Kofi, our technical assistant, for all of your support today. Join us again for part 2, Movement Capture and Counterinsurgency Protection Strategies.